What is going on, everyone? It's your guy Cole Jackson back here on Road Graders, and we are going to be getting you set up with information about the 2025 Baltimore Ravens salary cap. Our guy Brian McFarland over at the Russell Street Report put out his preview article. He is the go-to for all things Baltimore Ravens cap. So we're going to be going through his article. I put together some pieces that I want you guys to know about, but all of this work, all of this stuff I'm going to be presenting, it's all from Brian McFarland at Russell Street Report, all attribution to him. I'm not good with the cap, but I am going to give you guys some of my thoughts as we go through his information. So big shout out to Brian and to Russell Street Report for putting this together. This video is powered by BetUS. And BetUS wants to know, what do you think the team should focus on first? You can go over to BetUS and get in on some of the action in other sports. They got it all: hockey, basketball, college basketball, all that good stuff. YouTube, use promo code YouTube150. You get 150% sign up bonus on your first deposit and then 125% on your next two deposits. Thank you to BetUS for sponsoring. So let's dive into it. We're going to be just kind of walking through the key components of what's going to be going on and making sure you guys kind of understand as we get ready for the offseason and free agency in March. So when we take a look at the Ravens starting point, right? Because every year when the information comes out, it'll show the Ravens are never in a great position, right? It's always a couple million, under the cap. And then you look at a team like the Saints and they're always 65 million over the cap and all this stuff happens, right? So I kind of want to just walk through the starting point and some of the things that we could see happen before free agency opens in March. So the projected salary cap, and this is a big shoe to drop, is going to be between 270 and 275 million, obviously. So Brian's using 272.5 as a starting point. We'll get confirmation on that in the next couple weeks. But obviously, if that goes up, nothing but good news for the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens are also going to add 2.1 million from the 2024 cap carryover. So they ended the 2024 season with 2.1 million in salary cap space that gets added to their cap room. And then rule of 51. So salary cap calculation is done with the highest 51 salary cap numbers on the team. So if you're making vet minimum or you're below the 50 for, if you're the 52nd, 53rd player, it doesn't count towards the salary cap. It's important because when we talk about UFAs, some of these guys like Brent Urban come back on the vet minimum and they don't actually impact the salary cap, or it's a very negligible impact because they're at the bottom rung of that rule of 51. And then so everyone outside the 51, their base salaries don't count, only bonus prorations and obviously dead money will count against the cap in addition to the rule of 51. So that right now they have 53 players under contract. The top 51 players, that's a cap hit of 268 million. So obviously you can see right there with those players under contract, we're getting really close to that 272.5. There was also significant, I wouldn't say, I don't know, I guess I haven't really looked closely at this in the past, but 2.9 and incentive adjustment seems like a lot. So that was 2 million from Derrick Henry for hitting his not likely to be earned. If it's likely to be earned, it gets applied to the 2024 cap. If it's not likely to be earned, it gets applied to the 2025 cap. So incentives earned last year: 2 million to Derrick Henry, 750 to Kyle Van Noy, 750 to Patrick McCarry, and 250 to Marlon Humphrey, add up to that number that it's going to hit. So they got to factor those into, as well as workout bonuses. So that gets them to a starting point of about $2 million. So again, this is their starting point. This is before they've done any UFAs, restricted free agents, all that good stuff. So obviously starting point being in the green, good thing. But once we get into the first step kind of in the offseason is you'll look at your ERFAs and your RFAs. And the Ravens don't have a whole bunch this year. You got Owen Wright as your exclusive rights free agent. It just costs $840 to tender him. They'll probably do that again. He won't count against the rule of 51. So there's not really a reason, as long as he's healthy enough. Bring back Owen Wright for training camp. Let him compete. It doesn't have a cap impact. There's no reason not to do it. And then the other restricted free agents, one being Christian Matthew, who I'm putting as a non-tender. I don't know why they do that. Obviously, he was just brought in as a special team depth guy on the practice squad, so he'll be released and his contract will be voided. But then they have Ardarius Washington, and this is where it becomes a little bit more significant. So if you look at the bottom in the box, there's 4 types of RFA tenders. All 4 have a different cap charge. So if they were to, obviously they can't do a low, well, I guess they could do a lower original round, but he was a UDFA, so they can't use that. So there's basically 3 options. They could tender him with a first round, a second round, or the right of first refusal. And you can see the cap differences. So if they did a first round, they would be charged 7.2 for the 1-year deal. And that means if a team was to sign him to an offer sheet, they'd have to give the Ravens a first round pick. Not going to happen for Ardarius Washington. So it becomes either second round or a right of first refusal. And so if it's a right of first refusal, if a team offers, the Ravens get to match that contract and retain Ardarius Washington to whatever that team negotiated to a contract. So let's say the Titans come out of nowhere, classic Titans example, and they sign him they give him an offer sheet of 3 years, $30 million. The Ravens could match that and retain Ardarius Washington on that contract, or he would leave. And because there was no tender, the Ravens don't get any compensation. So I think for the extra $2 million, they'll probably give him a second round tender because it protects him. Either the Ravens get a second round pick or they get Ardarius Washington for 1 year at $5.2 million. He is a starter on this team. I think it makes a lot more sense. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But with Marcus Williams being released and the Ardarius Washington's play throughout the season, I think it's likely the Ravens will want to keep him, and they'll probably go with that second round tender. So just to give you an example, when we look at where we started, $2 million, once they tender him, they're now $3 million over the salary cap. Then we look at our unrestricted free agents, and I wouldn't say significant. Obviously, the most significant being Ronnie Stanley. That's going to be a major decision. But there are a few guys, a guy like Patrick Ricard, that I think the Ravens want to keep. I think if you look at the statements made by John Harbaugh in the postseason press conference, I think he wants to keep Patrick Ricard. It's all going to be about the market, right? There's only 10, 11 teams use a fullback. So how big is the market for Patrick Ricard? I think that might be an interesting case. He wants to be a Raven. They want him to be a Raven. They just have to work out the dollars and cents. As long as it's a reasonable contract, happy to have Patrick Ricard back. He's a tone setter. He's a culture setter. I think it's really, we saw what he did with Derrick Henry this year. That's a lot of beef in the backfield. So I think we'll see how that goes. And then the other guy that I highlighted is Tylan Wallace, a guy that I think they'd love to get back on a cheap deal. I don't think he'd have a major market. So getting him back, maybe even on a multi-year deal, give him a little bit of job security and keep that cap hit low for the next couple of years. So if they gave him like a 4-year deal and kept the cap hit low in the first 2 years, would really help their cap situation. Then you look around at some of the other guys. Someone like Brent Urban, who's already announced he's coming back this year, is a guy that they could scoop up later in the summer, cheap. Trey White is a guy that, they may want to bring back cheap because he played well when he was here. He wasn't leaned on a ton, but he seemed to enjoy his time here. They enjoyed his time here. They will not be bringing back Deontay Johnson. I don't think they'll bring back Nelson Aguilar either. Josh Johnson, we'll see. They need a backup quarterback. Devin Leary's around, but they seem to enjoy having Josh Johnson on the roster. Christian Mulch, Chris Board, again, guys like Brent Urban that might be brought back on the min. I'd personally love to see Chris Board be brought back. And the real wild card here, and I should have highlighted them because I wanted to talk about them. Well, there's kind of 2. I think McCarry's going to be gone. Cleveland's going to be gone. Josh Jones will be an interesting one. I think getting him here, using him as a 6-man, developing him a little bit as a tackle was really interesting for the Ravens, and they still don't have a developing offensive tackle on their roster. So they may choose to try and bring him back. They may also want to bring him back if Ronnie Stanley isn't brought back because they'll need someone to compete with a rookie, and they might see Josh Jones as being that type of guy. And then the other one is Brandon Stevens. Obviously a very polarizing guy. His stock dropped a lot this year compared to if he did an early extension last year, but it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. I know a lot of Ravens fans don't want him back, but if his contract's low, the Ravens obviously feel like he's a starting caliber quarterback because even though they brought in Trey White, they didn't seek another starter. It's not like they went after Marshawn Lattimore, who was available, even though they did explore him. So that's relevant. But we'll see what happens with Brandon Stevens. I know it's not a popular opinion, but we'll see what happens. And obviously drop a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think about the UFAs you want Personally, to me, Patrick Ricard and Ronnie Stanley have to be the priority. I really don't want to go into the draft not having a left tackle on the roster. I think it's a position that has to be drafted at a minimum in the first 2 rounds. And, the option of swinging Roger Rosengarten over to the left side definitely exists, but then you have to draft another offensive tackle again in the first couple rounds. It just really pigeonholes their options. Whereas if I know my core is Ronnie Stanley, Tyler Linderbaum, and Roger Rosengarten as my tackles and center, I'm really just looking to upgrade my guard positions, and I can play that BPA through the draft a little bit stronger. We'll see what happens there. Obviously, I'd like to bring back Ricard. The question is, how do the Ravens create cap space? Because this is, again, if we go back to this number, the Ravens are going to have to create cap space. And there's obviously a few ways to do it. So first, to take a look at, there's the extension option. So they have guys with some pretty big cap hits. You got Derrick Henry, Mark Andrews, and Odafe Oweh, who are in the last years of their deal in 2025. That makes them extension candidates. Mark Andrews obviously is also a release candidate that's been talked about, or a trade candidate. So we'll get into him a little bit more specifically here in a minute. But Derrick Henry kind of strikes me. I put it on Twitter. He announced at NFL Awards that he wanted to retire Raven. So if he wants to be here and his cap hit this year is 12.8, try and find an extension. If they could lower his cap hit by as much as $5 million if they extended him. I don't really see, based on what we saw last year, I don't see the issue with that. I'd try and get him a 2-year extension. I know it's getting up there in age, but until Derrick Henry shows me that he's a declining player, it's hard to just call him that, right? So if they can get a reasonable AAV over those next couple of years, and they're able to do that, and it does carry them to 34 or 33, that is what it is. But they need to find a way to get that 12.9 million down, because if he's just a UFA next year and you're doing a 2-year deal or 1-year deals, I don't really see the downside, because if he's on a 1-year deal, that cap hit's going to be higher. If it's a 1-year $8 million hit, they're going to have to pay that $8 million out next year. I'd rather create some space this year and have a heavier year later. Yeah, you're kicking the can down the road, but that's just how these contracts go. Then you get a guy like Odafe Oweh, another polarizing guy that gets discussed. It's a tough one. It won't be cheap. It really comes down to if they think he's maxed out. Obviously, he took a bit of a step up this year. He got to the 10 sacks. He hit double-digit sacks. Wasn't quite there in consistent pressure. I think his pass rush win rate wasn't quite what I want to see out of him. I'd like to see it a little bit higher if they see him as a franchise edge rusher. And that's really what I think this comes down to, is what do they see him as? Or is he a starter? Is he better as a rotational guy? If you look at his numbers, he had 452 snaps, which ranked 18th among edge rushers. He had 10 sacks, which was 15th, so good. 48 pressures, which was 29th. And his 13.2 pass rush win rate was 39th amongst edge rushers. So he was a guy that thrived getting pressures and sacks on a higher snap count and less efficiency. And Kyle Van Noy was much the same way. His pass rush win rate was 51st. So they just didn't have consistent win rates from their edge rushers. So is that a guy you extend at a $13.2 million cap hit? It's a tough one to swallow. So they got to make a decision there. Obviously, they're going to be drafting at the edge rusher position, but do they see him being a guy that's going to be around for a few years and they can lower that with an extension? So a big decision to make there. Then there's Lamar Jackson. So we'll get to restructures here in a minute. Restructuring is obviously an option, but that's going to increase the 2026 and 2027. So when you restructure, it spreads out the cap hits that you're saving over the remaining years on the contract. So if they restructure him, they're going to save a bunch of money, but then they're just going to add that to 26 and 27, and that $74 million cap charge for the next 2 years just goes up. So they could extend him and try and work out with those void years and the UFA years, how they could possibly lower that cap hit this year with an extension. To me, a Lamar Jackson extension would be wonderful. We've seen that he is the type of pocket passer where once his legs start to decline, it's not going to matter because he's cerebral from the pocket. So I'm not worried about his age at all. He's still only 28 years old. I want Lamar to retire Raven. So that I would be starting with a Lamar and Derrick Henry, I think, are two easy extensions to do. And then you get Marlon Humphrey, which is a little bit of a trickier one. Return to form this year, was to me an all-pro type player. And so they have obviously him here for 2 more years, but he's at a $25 million cap hit this year. That's a lot. He's 29 years old, so this is going to carry him into 30. So do they see him being a career Raven, basically, is the question. If so, you do an extension, you save a little bit of money. I think it makes sense. And it's not going to, again, if you restructure his deal, which you can, it's just going to add to next year. So you're kicking the can down the road on that. I guess an extension's technically kicking the can as well. But I would like to see them get a couple more years to be more flexible with what that looks like. Mark Andrews, and we'll talk about him here first and foremost. I don't really know what to do with Mark Andrews, to be honest. So they could extend him if they feel, if they feel that, they're going to roll with Andrews, Likely, and Kolar. Those are your 3 horsemen. Roll with them. Sure. I can see that. Before the playoffs, I would have been all for it. He kind of returned to form mid-season, went on to be a top 5 tight end, which we know he can be, except in the postseason, which is the problem. So that brings up this conversation. The risk reward here, or the payoff, is you could save $11 million by cutting him, and you only incur 5.9 in dead cap. And then you move on to Likely and Kolar as your 1-2, and they've shown that they can do it, right? So this becomes a really interesting conversation very quickly. So is Mark Andrews going to be a long-term guy and a guy that you want to have a large cap hit in a couple of years as he gets a little bit older? Or do you cut bait now, save $11 million, which $11 million is pretty significant. That could be a good chunk of a Ronnie Stanley contract, for example. What they do with Mark Andrews is going to be very interesting. And that's not factoring in, sorry, I keep saying cut, but they could also trade him, right, and still get those savings plus get an asset back. To me personally, Mark Andrews is my guy. I love him, but it's all about what assets can you remove and have a backup plan at. Mark Andrews, again, in the regular season has been a consistent top 5 tight end, top 3 for most of his career. It's the playoffs. He's had issues. You can't hide from those. So, with the cap hit being 16.9 million and a guy like Isaiah Likely, who I think is ready to be a number 1, to me, you got to find savings somewhere, right? You can't pay everybody. I just think that if they can trade him and get an asset plus the savings plus move Likely into the number 1 spot, to me, that makes the most sense. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful to Mark Andrews. Again, one of my favorite players, but I think that needs to be taken pretty seriously. Arthur Millette, $2.25 million. I think that'll be a pretty quick decision. I think they'll probably cut him. Just unfortunately, he couldn't stay healthy, and he's kind of lost. Like, I wanted him back. I was excited when they signed him, but I think they'll look to get those savings. That's a decent chunk of money. That's half of our Darius Washington, for example. Michael Pierce, I don't think it's as relevant here. They're not going to cut him, but he could retire, and you'll see some savings. Justin Tucker. This is a tough one because we just don't know what's going on, right? Like, there's been no information. I haven't heard anything outside of what's been reported. So they could use, if they're not going to cut him pre-June 1st, but they could cut him post-June 1st, and you see they'll get the 4.2 million in cap savings. So that'll be an interesting decision. Brody could be a post-June 1st as well. I kind of doubt it, just not enough savings, and he played pretty well down the stretch. I think they'll want to maintain some of that depth with the interior defensive line. And he's been pretty healthy and durable, which is important. So, and then obviously Marcus Williams, who I probably should have led with. So they reworked his deal to create 9.9 million in 2025 cap space. They designated him as a June 1st. Usually you don't see those savings until after June 1st, but because Marcus Williams agreed to rework his deal, they got those savings immediately. They'll get an additional 2.1 million on June 2nd, which is important because that'll factor into that budget that they like to keep for in-season moves and practice squad elevations and all that stuff. So that's what's going on with Marcus Williams. So again, just to kind of summarize, cut trade candidates, Mark Andrews, Arthur Millette, I think will be cut. Mark Andrews, to me, that's the difficult decision. So you're basically at a couple decisions so far. You got the Ronnie Stanley big decision to make about whether or not you're going to resign him. You got the Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry extension options, possibly Marlon Humphrey. And then you got the Mark Andrews decision about whether to cut or extend. It's going to be or trade, cut, or extend. And then you take a look at the restructures. So this is obviously a way that they can create cap space. So they can create $15 million alone by restructuring Lamar Jackson's deal. So that $15 million will be applied to spread out over the next 2 years. So it'll increase his next two contracts or his next 2 years of cap hit by $7.5 million. So that's what I mean. There's obviously a downside to restructuring. You get some pretty big savings right away, but it adds money down the road to those contracts. You look at Roquan, Ndamukong, Rashad, I think they'll probably restructure those. There's $15 million right there. So they can create cap space pretty quickly. But to me, like $15 million is a lot to restructure Lamar Jackson. But again, you go back to his contract, you see $74 million in the next 2 years. So you're going to be adding 7.5 to that. So now it's $81 million in 26 and $81 million in 2027. That's why I think an extension makes a little bit more sense for Lamar. Marlon Humphrey is pretty similar, right? 11 million, but it would add, I guess all 11 would get added to 2026. So then now he's up to 33 million next year, even though he's saving 11 this year. So again, it's all about the risk reward and how they want to do it. But I feel like Lamar and Marlon are better extension candidates. But Roquan, Namde, and Rashad Bateman, they have a couple more years in their deals. You see, Matabike's goes till 2029, so they'd be spreading that $5 million across multiple years. So it'd be like $1 million addition per year. So that makes a little bit more sense. So to summarize where they stand, there's just not a lot of levers for them to pull to create space. Usually you see this cut list with a little bit more savings, and that's where you can kind of see them moving on from some players in the last year of their deal that gets you some savings. As you can see, they just don't have a lot of those options. So that's why I'm more focused on some of these extensions. I think that's what I want you guys to take away. I think there's more cap saving options in extensions than in restructures this year, because having Marlon Humphrey expire in 2026 and Lamar expire in 2027, that's adding significant cap dollars to Marlon in 26 and Lamar in 26 and 27. That makes restructures a little bit less appetizing to me. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Would you guys handle this? Let me know. Drop a comment down below if you enjoyed this breakdown. And again, a huge thank you to Brian McFarland for all the information he provided. I'll drop the article down in the link so you guys can go check it out for yourself. Russell Street Report's the best to go for your salary cap information, bar none. And obviously, if you're new here, hit subscribe. We'll be going through some mock off-season scenarios and some contract situations over the next couple of weeks as we get ready for March and the free agency period to open. So be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and thank you to BetUS for sponsoring this episode.